So India just printed 8.2% of GDP growth, the fastest in the last 6 quarters. So the global headlines read that India outruns the world again. So recognized now as a major power by Australia's Lowy Institute, ranked above Japan and Russia, thanks to India's rising military capability and the shockwaves of Operation Sindoor. But here's the paradox that nobody wants to talk about. So on the global stage, India is a major power, but at home, the fundamentals are flashing yellow. But here's the plot twist: inflation is nearly zero, wages are not booming, tax collections are slowing, and the IMF just gave India's GDP data a C grade. So why do markets and economists keep saying that it's a great number, but take it with a pinch of salt? So tonight on Front Page, we're unpacking why so many experts don't fully buy the 8.2% story and what this means for your job, your salary and India's growth narrative. But before we do that, make sure to like, share and subscribe to AIM Network. So on paper, Q2 FY26 looks like a dream. You have the real GDP at 8.2%, nominal GDP at 8.7%. So normally in a developing economy, nominal growth is 3 to 4 percentage points higher than the real growth because prices are rising faster. But this time the gap is just at 0.5%. But why? Because inflation has collapsed. CPI inflation in October stood at 0.25%, a record low. This means that wholesale prices are falling, food prices, especially vegetables, are in a free fall. And economists call this the deflator problem, which is if your price deflator is weirdly low, your real growth number can look artificially high, even if the underlying activity hasn't exploded. So that's why many economists are saying that the growth on ground does not feel like 8% and markets are discounting the headline. Now let's look at the real world indicators, because company revenues for many non-financial firms are growing around 5 to 6%, well below the nominal GDP. The wage and compensation growth in the formal sector is closer to 6 to 7% and real wage growth has been flat for years. And the manufacturing output in September is at around 4.8% and not 9 to 10%. GST collections in October grew only at 4.6%, slower than nominal GDP at 8.7%. And about tax revenues, they usually grow faster than the economy and not slower. Add to it one more puzzle. If the economy is genuinely on fire at 8% plus for the last 3 quarters, you'd expect higher inflation, not just 0.25%. You'd also expect higher bond yields, wider current account deficit, and even stronger credit growth, but most of that is missing. And that's why one expert called it a conundrum, which is policymakers are behaving as if demand is weak, cutting rates, easing liquidity, and rationalizing GST, while the GDP series says that the demand is roaring. So just days before the 8.2% print, the IMF quietly released its annual report on India. Buried in the technical annex was a C grade for national accounts, the very system that produces GDP. Look, this is not the IMF saying India is faking numbers. That's not it. It's saying that the methods and the coverage have weaknesses which are big enough to hamper the analysis. Here are the key issues that they flag. So they're taking the outdated base here because GDP is still benchmarked to 2011 to 12. Look, that's pre-UPI, pre-4G explosion and pre-platform work. The further we move from that year, the less it reflects today's economy. And deflators that don't fully capture reality, because India still leans on wholesale price indices and simple methods where modern producer price indices are missing. So when inflation is unusually low, even small errors in the deflator can swing real growth by half a percentage point or more. Then of course they point towards the gaps between what we produce and what we spend. So there's a large discrepancy between the production and the expenditure sides of the GDP, which hint at the undercoverage of consumption in the informal sector. So in a country where a huge chunk of activity is informal, this really matters. The next point is the lack of a seasonal adjustment, because quarterly GDP isn't adjusted for, like, let's say monsoon, Diwali or year-end patterns. So festive quarter can flatter the trend and a bad monsoon can fake a slowdown. So India has pushed back calling the IMF's grading skewed and unfair. But both sides agree on one fundamental thing, that the statistical machinery needs an upgrade. But now comes the real question. So is the 8.2% GDP growth fake? Short answer no, but it's not gospel either. Because most economists agree on three broad points. India is growing faster than most big economies. Consumption, construction, services, and some manufacturing have clearly picked up. And the exact decimal 8.2 versus 7.3 versus 6.8 is less reliable because with deflator quirks, outdated base year, and an informal sector gap, that 8.2% is best read as strong growth but with a wide margin of error. So the risk map hasn't disappeared. 50% of US tariffs on Indian exports are already biting. Export momentum may slow once front-loaded orders are done. And labor force participation is also rising, which can also signal distress, not just opportunity, as more family members look for work. Look, let's get it right. Yes, India is likely still the fastest growing large economy. But the story is more 6 to 7% with measurement noise than a clean, precise 8.2% miracle. And for ordinary Indians like us, this debate is not an academic one. Because if nominal incomes are only growing 5 to 6%, an 8.2% headline doesn't pay the bills. Look at your salary hikes, hiring trends, and real wage growth, and not just the GDP charts. Then, of course, prices, ultra low inflation feels good now. But prolonged deflation in farm incomes and input prices can hurt rural demand and investment. And with inflation this low, the RBI technically has room to cut rates again, and some economists want at least one more 25 bps cut. But if growth is overstated, policy errors become easier. So as India aims for a $5 trillion economy and pitches itself as the world's growth engine, trusted data becomes a strategic asset. Because investors care as much as how you count as what you claim. But there is definitely a good news. A big overhaul is already in motion. We have a new base year, better price indices, and more informal sector coverage. And the next few years will quietly decide whether India upgrades from a C on paper to an A in practice. And yet, in the middle of all of this GDP debate, one thing is crystal clear. Global capital isn't turning from India, it's doubling down. As Blackstone's CEO put it just days ago, he said that India is the G10's fastest growing country, investing massively in infrastructure, markets, and its rising middle class. This is the place we particularly like. So here's our final take. India is officially the third most powerful country in Asia. We can agree on all of that. Then you have Operation Sindoor, rising military rankings, global influence, all pointing upward. Yet our economic reality feels quite split. Stagnant wages, collapsing inflation, weak tax growth, and an IMF C on a GDP data. Then you also have Blackstone CEO saying India is the fastest growing country in the G10. This is a place we particularly like. So which India is real? The powerhouse the world sees, or the economy or numbers reveal? So do drop your thoughts in the comments below.